Washington, 1865. Over the White House, a different banner flutters, a crimson field crossed by blue, studded with white stars. The Confederate flag. Smoke clings to the ruins of Pennsylvania Avenue. Union cannons, once thunderous, lie silent. Abraham Lincoln has vanished from power, his voice silenced by defeat. America, fractured, bleeding, conquered. In this chilling vision, Confederate troops march through Washington, boots hammering the cobblestones like a drumbeat of triumph. Northern newspapers are seized. The Union Army, shattered, disarmed, humiliated. A nation that once proclaimed liberty now kneels to a government built on chains. The dream of one republic has collapsed. Two Americas now exist, side by side, divided forever. One built on freedom, the other on bondage. And the world watches. Britain and France, long skeptical of the Union, now toast to the birth of a new power, the Confederate States of America. But history is never so simple. For every victory carries a price. For every triumph, consequences. And the Confederacy's survival would ignite a chain reaction, shaking not only America, but the entire world. This is not the history we know. This is the history that could have been. History is a story written in ink. But it is also a story that could have been written in blood, had the smallest details shifted. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was not destined to end as it did. Victory for the Union was never guaranteed. At several critical junctures, the Confederacy stood on the razor's edge of triumph. But imagine if they had won. Picture a battlefield in Virginia. A single charge breaks Union lines, a general falls, and the momentum shifts. Picture a Southern diplomat in London. One handshake, one agreement, and foreign warships sail against the Union blockade. Picture Lincoln, isolated, broken, forced to concede. This is the essence of alternate history. To take the fragile architecture of reality and bend it, just slightly, until an entirely different world emerges. And in this world, the Confederacy does not collapse. Instead, it rises, cementing slavery, dividing the Republic, and altering the destiny of nations far beyond American shores. Why is this scenario so haunting? Because it very nearly happened. The Civil War was not simply North versus South. It was freedom versus bondage, industry versus agriculture, a centralized republic versus a fragile confederation. And yet, time and again, the Confederacy almost clawed its way to recognition, legitimacy, and survival. The stakes were immense. Had the South prevailed, the United States, as we know it, would not exist. Instead, two rival nations would face each other across a permanent border. Enemies in ideology, culture, and economy. One would march into the modern age. The other would be shackled to the old world, dragging millions of enslaved men and women with it. The ripple effects would stretch far beyond America. Without a united Union, would the United States have risen to global dominance in the 20th century? Would democracy itself have faltered under the weight of division? And in Europe, would the great empires have looked across the Atlantic and seen weakness, not strength? This is not idle speculation. It is a thought experiment grounded in real turning points. Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, the 1864 election, foreign intervention. Each moment was a coin toss in the storm. Flip it the other way, and the Confederacy survives. In this documentary, we will follow that alternate timeline step by step. We will march through smoky battlefields where victory comes not for the Union, but for the South. We will enter foreign palaces where diplomats gamble on America's fate. We will peer into the shattered heart of a divided republic and trace the chilling consequences of a Confederate triumph. This is not the story of the Civil War as it was. This is the story of the Civil War as it might have been. September 17, 1862. Antietam Creek. In our history, this was the bloodiest single day in American warfare. 23,000 men fell in cornfields, woods, and sunken roads. The Union stopped Lee's invasion of the North, and the Confederacy's dream of recognition from Europe slipped away. Lincoln seized the moment, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. The tide turned. But what if the tide had turned the other way? Imagine dawn breaking over the Maryland hills. The fog clings to the earth like a shroud. Confederate troops, hungry, ragged, but hardened by victory, stand ready. Across the creek, Union lines stretch, larger, fresher, better supplied. History says they held. But in this shadowed timeline, a single change unravels everything. General McClellan, ever cautious, delays once again. His orders stumble, mismanaged, arriving hours too late. Union divisions stand idle while Confederate forces strike first. Stonewall Jackson hurls his men into the cornfield with the fury of a thunderclap. The Union flank buckles. Cannon fire rips the morning apart. By midday, the sunken road, remembered as Bloody Lane, is not filled with Confederate dead, but with blue-coated soldiers, stacked like cordwood. Rebel yells pierce the smoke as Lee himself rides forward, his presence galvanizing men on the brink of collapse. The Union center breaks. Then comes the hammer blow. James Longstreet, commanding fresh divisions, smashes into the disordered Union left. Panic spreads. Lines unravel. McClellan hesitates, unwilling to commit his reserves, fearful of a trap. In that hesitation, the battle is lost. By late afternoon, Antietam is no longer a stalemate, it is a catastrophe. Union forces retreat in chaos, stumbling back across the Potomac. Wagons clog the crossings, cannons abandoned in the mud. Thousands surrender. Thousands more flee toward Washington. The cost is apocalyptic. The Union loses not just men, but morale. Newspapers call it the Great Rout. Soldiers who believed in the cause of the Union now whisper that the war is unwinnable. Lincoln, who in our world seized Antietam as his moment of strength, now faces his darkest hour. Without victory, there is no Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery remains untouched, its chains unbroken. And for the Confederacy, everything changes. Lee's gamble has paid off. His invasion of the North is no longer a desperate gamble, but a stunning triumph. Foreign diplomats in Richmond telegraph home. The South has broken the Union Army on its own soil. London and Paris, long hesitant, now consider recognition not only possible, but inevitable. The ripple spreads outward. Confederate newspapers declare it the Second War of Independence. Jefferson Davis proclaims a national day of thanksgiving. Enslavers toast to the preservation of their peculiar institution. And in the fields, millions of enslaved men and women hear the news with dread. Freedom, once a distant possibility, now seems to vanish like smoke. But perhaps the greatest consequence lies not in Maryland's soil, but in the road it opens. With Union forces shattered, Washington itself lies vulnerable. The capital of the United States, the beating heart of the Republic, is suddenly within Confederate reach. History remembers Antietam as the day the Union was saved. In this timeline, it becomes the day the Union was lost. The war has entered a new phase, one in which the Confederacy is no longer fighting for survival, but for conquest. And as the dust settles over Antietam Creek, the question looms like a storm cloud. If Washington falls, can the United States survive at all? The Potomac River. Late September, 1862. Smoke still clings to the fields of Maryland. Union soldiers, defeated, disheartened, scattered, stream southward in a broken tide. Horses collapse in exhaustion. Wagons are abandoned. The retreat from Antietam is more than a withdrawal. It is a collapse. And in the chaos, the road to Washington lies wide open. Robert E. Lee, weary yet relentless, seizes the moment. "Forward," he commands, his voice hoarse but resolute. Longstreet's divisions press on. Jackson's men push the flanks, and ragged but determined Confederate troops march with the momentum of destiny. They are not merely invading. They are striking at the Union's heart. Inside Washington, panic spreads like wildfire. The city is swollen with refugees, wounded soldiers, and desperate families. Rumors ripple through the streets. The rebels are coming. Lee is at the gates. Government clerks hastily pack records, hauling crates of documents out of offices. Treasury vaults are emptied and loaded onto trains bound for the North. And in the White House, Abraham Lincoln paces. His face is drawn, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. Advisors plead for evacuation. Union generals argue fiercely, some insisting they can rally defenses, others warning that staying risks capture or death. For the first time in the war, the Union capital itself hangs by a thread. The Confederate advance is merciless. Rebel cavalry probe the outskirts, burning supply depots, cutting telegraph wires. The countryside trembles with their approach. At Fort Stevens, hastily armed clerks and young recruits scramble to man the defenses. But they are no match for battle-hardened veterans marching under the stars and bars. Then the unthinkable, Washington is encircled. Confederate artillery positions on the Virginia side of the river roar to life, lobbing shells into the city. Explosions echo across the National Mall. The dome of the unfinished Capitol rattles. Civilians scream and scatter. The city of government, once untouchable, now trembles like any other battlefield town. Lincoln refuses to flee. "I will not abandon this city," he insists, his voice trembling yet resolute. But his words carry little comfort as the Confederate tide surges closer. On Pennsylvania Avenue, soldiers dig trenches, their shovels clanging desperately against stone and dirt. But the defense is too little, too late. At dawn, the Confederates strike. Gray uniforms surge through the northern approaches, banners whipping in the autumn wind. Union defenders break, their lines crumbling under relentless assault. Rebel yells slice through the smoke as cannon fire rips the heart of the capital. The city falls street by street, house by house, until finally, the White House itself looms in sight. In this alternate history, the unimaginable becomes reality. Washington is captured. Confederate troops march triumphantly down Pennsylvania Avenue, their boots pounding the stones once reserved for Union parades. The stars and bars are raised over the Capitol dome. A stunned world watches, as the very symbol of the Union lies in enemy hands. The consequences are immediate. Lincoln, forced to flee or risk capture, becomes a president without a capital. The federal government scatters northward, retreating to Philadelphia. The psychological blow is incalculable. The Union, once the unbreakable republic, now looks fractured, fragile, and defeated. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis sends a message to Richmond. "We have driven the invader from our soil. Their capital is ours. Independence is assured." Southern newspapers explode with jubilation. In Charleston, church bells ring. In Richmond, fireworks blaze across the night sky. For the Confederacy, it is not just a victory, it is vindication. But victories carry burdens. Washington's fall emboldens the South, but it also provokes dangerous questions. Can the Confederacy truly hold such a prize? Will foreign powers, seeing the Union humiliated, finally step in? And for Lincoln, the choice is clear yet terrible. Continue the war at unimaginable cost, or seek peace with the South on its terms. For now, America stands broken, its heart torn out, its destiny uncertain. And in this alternate world, the dream of one nation under one flag dies. Not with a whisper, but with the thunder of Confederate guns over Washington. London, autumn of 1862. The news travels across the Atlantic like lightning. The Confederacy has won at Antietam. Washington has fallen. Lincoln's government has fled. The Union bleeds. And in the drawing rooms of Europe's great capitals, smoke from cigars curls into the air as men of power debate the future of America. Britain and France had long watched the American conflict with unease. The North's blockade of southern ports strangled the flow of cotton that fed Europe's textile mills. Manchester factories stood idle, their workers restless, hungry, ready to riot. French ambitions in Mexico dangled in the balance, Napoleon III hungry to expand his empire in the Americas. The South's survival could open doors. But until now, both empires hesitated. The Union still looked strong, too strong. Recognition of the Confederacy meant war with Washington, a gamble neither London nor Paris wished to take. Yet Washington's fall changes everything. The mighty republic has been humbled. The United States looks like a collapsing experiment. And in European corridors of power, weakness smells like opportunity. In London, Prime Minister Lord Palmerston gathers his ministers in a chamber thick with pipe smoke and tension. Maps of America sprawl across the table, red pins marking Confederate victories, blue pins retreating north. "Gentlemen," he says, his voice grave but deliberate, "the question before us is no longer whether the Confederacy can endure. It is whether we can afford not to recognize it." Arguments rage. Some ministers argue for caution, fearing that open support for Richmond would provoke a bitter, endless war with the North. Others, led by Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell, press for recognition, insisting that Confederate independence is inevitable and Britain must be on the winning side. "Cotton is the lifeblood of our industry," Russell declares. "And cotton flows from Dixie, not New York." Across the Channel, in Paris, Napoleon III is far less hesitant. The French emperor dreams of resurrecting empire in the New World. His soldiers already march in Mexico, propping up Archduke Maximilian as a puppet emperor. A Confederate victory would guarantee his ambitions. To Napoleon, recognition of the South is not just a diplomatic choice, it is strategy. "A divided America is a weak America," he tells his ministers. "And a weak America is one we can manage." Behind closed doors, emissaries of the Confederacy move like shadows. In London's drawing rooms, Confederate diplomat James Mason pours glasses of brandy for sympathetic MPs, whispering promises of endless cotton shipments and shared prosperity. In Paris, John Slidell dines with French aristocrats, painting a vision of a powerful Southern ally standing shoulder to shoulder with Europe. They speak of tradition, aristocracy, and order. The South as the natural partner to Europe's monarchies against the rough, industrial democracy of the Union. Meanwhile, Union diplomats scramble desperately to counter the tide. Charles Francis Adams, the American ambassador in London, warns that recognition of the Confederacy would mean war. War not just with Washington, but with a people who will never accept dismemberment. His speeches thunder with warnings, but his words fall on ears more interested in profit than principle. The fate of the Union now teeters on the polished tables of European salons. Every whispered promise, every raised glass, every signature inked in shadow could change the balance of the world. And as the smoke thickens, one question haunts the room. If Britain and France choose recognition, will Confederate independence become not just possible, but unstoppable? Winter bites the Atlantic. Steam hisses. Iron plates sweat salt. And from Halifax to Bermuda, anchors lift. The first to appear off the Carolina Capes is a long, lean shadow. Her Majesty's ship warrior, black-hulled, ironclad, and implacable. Behind her, a chain of screw frigates and gunboats fan out like a steel net. Signal flags crack in the wind. Engines churn. The Royal Navy is moving. Recognition has not yet been declared, but the message is unmistakable. Britain and France will not let Southern cotton rot in bales while Manchester starves and Lyon idles. Neutrality with teeth, the papers call it. Protected corridors. Convoys escorting commerce, in the name of humanitarian relief. In practice, the effect is simple. The Union blockade begins to bleed. At dawn off Cape Hatteras, lookouts on a weather-beaten Union sloop spot unfamiliar silhouettes. Not Confederate. European. A British frigate signals. This passage is under the protection of Her Britannic Majesty. The Union captain hesitates. His guns are old. His boilers wheeze. He remembers Washington's fall. He lowers his colors and drifts aside. A week later, the French make their play in the Gulf. La Gloire, sleek, armored, deadly, slides past the shoals near the Mississippi's mouth. Behind her, trim corvettes and transports fly the tricolor. Officially, they are safeguarding neutral shipping and humanitarian relief to New Orleans. Unofficially, they open a window through which the Confederacy inhales. The change is immediate. Charleston's wharves, dead and silent for months, burst to life. Cranes creak. Bales thump. Steam tugs whistle. Cotton climbs gangways. In return, crates arrive. Rifles and straw, gunpowder in barrels, boots stacked like bricks, machine tools crated with care. The blockade, the Union's strangling coil, loosens. Not everywhere. Not at once. But enough. Liverpool shipyards hum like hives. Men in leather aprons rivet iron. The Laird rams, once a diplomatic scandal in our reality, now slip to sea under foreign flags and careful fictions. Sleek commerce raiders stretch their legs in the mid-Atlantic, hunting Union merchantmen. Insurance rates in New York spike. Wall Street jitters. The sea, once a Union advantage, turns treacherous. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis reads the cables with a measured smile. Providence favors the patient, he tells his cabinet. The War Department moves fast. New rifles are issued to regiments that carried flintlocks last month. Artillery batteries receive Whitworth guns, long-ranged and cruel. Quartermasters who once traded shoes like gold now stack crates with confidence. The Confederate Army, lean and hungry, discovers the taste of supply. In Washington, no longer Washington but Philadelphia, the mood curdles. Cabinet meetings crackle with fury. The Navy Department demands authority to confront British escorts. The State Department pleads caution. Lincoln listens, jaw clenched, eyes hollow from nights without sleep. Fight Europe and the South? Or swallow humiliation while rebuilding the army? Every choice feels like a trap. On the street, anger boils. Newspapers shout betrayal. Dockworkers curse royal meddling. Abolitionists warn that European intervention will nail slavery to the continent forever. In draft-worn neighborhoods, mutterings grow. Men ask why they must bleed when kings across the water pick the victor with a wave. The war at sea intensifies. Off Wilmington, a Union squadron attempts a show of force, hemming in a cotton convoy. A British captain runs up a crisp signal. The reply from the Union flagship is a sullen silence. Minutes stretch. Cannon stay quiet. The Royal Navy passes, serene and unchallenged, its guns speaking a language older than diplomacy. Meanwhile, on the ground, the effect ripples outward. Confederate cavalry now ride with more ammunition than bravado. Rail depots no longer starve. Commissary wagons rattle with biscuit and salt pork. In New Orleans, cafe tables clatter again with cups and spoons. Sugar returns to the coffee. A small detail. A quiet triumph. For the enslaved, the news lands like thunder. Patrols thicken. Hounds are fed well. Plantations that had wavered, unsure of a withering Confederacy, harden their grip. A few still run for the swamps and the rivers and the rumor of northern lines. But those lines feel farther away now, blurred by the sea's betrayal. Europe watches with cool satisfaction. The crisis in Manchester eases as cotton spindles begin to turn. In Paris, Napoleon III studies maps of Mexico and smiles thinly. The shadow of the Monroe Doctrine shrinks when the Union's reach shortens. In London, Palmerston reads reports of quiet American ships and louder British confidence, and decides that recognition can wait, because reality is recognizing itself. Then the first sparks. A Union gunboat, frayed and furious, misreads a signal off Bermuda and fires a warning shot across the bow of a British merchantman. The shell splashes harmlessly, but not quietly. Dispatches fly. The Admiralty fumes. Philadelphia blanches. For 48 hours the Atlantic balance trembles on a knife. It doesn't topple. Not yet. Cooler hands smother the flame. But everyone understands what nearly happened, and what might happen next time. By spring, the statistics mock the blockade. Confederate exports rise. Union imports fall. Loans from European banks reach Richmond through discreet channels. The Confederacy, once suffocating, breathes. The Union, once unassailable, gasps. Power shifts with the tide. Elections loom like storms. In back rooms, Northern politicians count votes and casualties, weighing peace against honor. On a desk in Philadelphia, a draft proclamation sits unsent, its promise of emancipation now a question mark in a world where ironclads fly foreign flags. The sea has chosen sides, or pretended to. And the capital, exiled and embattled, must answer a question that can no longer be postponed. How does a president fight two wars at once, without losing both? Philadelphia, early 1863. Snow dusts the cobblestones outside Independence Hall. Soldiers in blue, their boots worn thin, stand guard on street corners. The air reeks of coal smoke and uncertainty. This is no longer Washington. The capital of the Union has shifted north, away from the smoking ruins of its true seat of power. But the man at the center of it all, Abraham Lincoln, remains. And never has his burden been heavier. Lincoln is a president without a city, a commander-in-chief whose armies bleed on every front. His beard is streaked with gray, his frame gaunt, his eyes sunken with sleepless nights. He paces the narrow rooms of the borrowed presidential residence, every creak of the floorboards echoing like the weight of a divided nation. Letters flood his desk. Some plead for hope. Others demand surrender. A group of Northern governors, emboldened by defeat, suggest negotiations with Richmond. Copperhead Democrats whisper of armistice, of peace at any price. In taverns and newspapers, men mutter, "The war is lost. Why let more sons die?" Lincoln's cabinet is fractured. Secretary of State Seward insists Britain and France must be deterred, even if it means threatening war. Salmon Chase, ever ambitious, urges financial caution. Taxes climb, bonds strain, riots simmer. Stanton at war fumes with rage, demanding new drafts, more men, harsher measures. Each voice pulls Lincoln in a different direction, tearing at the fragile sinews of government. The press is merciless. The New York World calls him the Undertaker of the Union. Caricatures depict him as a gaunt skeleton, leading America into the grave. The public, weary of sacrifice, begins to wonder if McClellan, the cautious General Lincoln once dismissed, was right all along. The whispers grow louder. Perhaps McClellan could do better as president. Meanwhile, Confederate victories multiply. With foreign goods pouring through reopened ports, the South grows bolder. Lee, his legend magnified by Washington's fall, prowls Virginia like a lion, daring the Union to strike. Cavalry raids torch depots deep in Pennsylvania. Each Confederate incursion is reported as proof that Lincoln cannot protect his people. And then there is the matter of emancipation. In the world we know, Antietam's costly stalemate gave Lincoln the chance to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war into a crusade for freedom. But in this alternate world, Antietam was disaster. The proclamation sits unwritten. Without victory, Lincoln lacks the strength to wield such a moral weapon. The enslaved wait in vain for liberation. Their hope dims, their chains tighten. The war remains one of power, not of principle. Lincoln knows this truth, gnaws at the soul of the Republic. He writes drafts by lamplight, his pen scratching furiously, declarations of freedom, warnings to Europe, promises to the people. Yet each draft is crumpled and burned. Without battlefield triumph, his words feel like ashes. In the city streets, anger boils. Draft riots erupt, mobs torching homes and attacking officials. The government scrambles troops to restore order, but every crackdown feeds resentment. Lincoln is a tyrant, his enemies claim. Lincoln is a failure, others sneer. Each insult lands heavier than a cannonball. Yet still he endures. In private, Lincoln admits to despair, scribbling in letters that history may judge him a broken man. But in public, he stands tall, even as shadows lengthen. His speeches are fewer, shorter, tinged with sorrow. "We must not falter," he tells crowds, his voice cracking. But the cheers are thin, the applause brittle. By spring, the crisis sharpens. Elections loom. Peace Democrats smell blood. Newspapers float McClellan's name as the next president, the man who will end the war with a handshake. And in Richmond, Jefferson Davis reads Northern headlines with satisfaction. "The Yankees are devouring their own president," he remarks coldly. For Lincoln, time is running out. His government staggers under the weight of defeat. His people lose faith. His enemies circle like vultures. The question is no longer whether the Union can win, but whether Lincoln himself can survive politically long enough to fight another day. And as the election year approaches, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The President of the United States is not just at war with the Confederacy. He is at war with his own crumbling nation. The year is 1864. The republic that once felt unshakable now limps toward an election drenched in blood. In our history, the tide of war shifted by this moment. Sherman marched through Georgia, Grant hammered Lee into the trenches, and Lincoln, though battered, won re-election, securing the death warrant of the Confederacy. But in this alternate world, everything is inverted. The Union has known only retreat, humiliation, and loss. Washington lies in Confederate hands, the blockade broken by foreign powers, the dream of emancipation stillborn. And into this storm steps the most consequential election in American history. The Democratic Party seizes the moment like wolves circling a wounded deer. Peace Democrats, Copperheads, fill halls with their thunder. They call Lincoln a tyrant, a failure, a butcher of northern sons. They whisper that 4 more years of his rule will bring only more graves and no victory. Their candidate? George B. McClellan, the General Lincoln once dismissed for cowardice, now reborn as a statesman of peace. McClellan campaigns with a careful mask. He pledges to restore the Union, but through negotiation, not endless slaughter. He does not promise Confederate recognition, but his meaning is clear: an armistice, a settlement, a divided America. For weary Northerners, the promise glimmers like salvation. Lincoln, meanwhile, staggers into the race like a man walking through fire. His speeches are heavy, solemn, haunted by defeat. "We must not abandon the great experiment of liberty," he pleads. But the crowds are smaller, the applause thinner, the laughter absent. Many in his own party doubt his survival. Some whisper of replacing him at the convention. Only loyalty, and the lack of any alternative, keeps him on the ticket. The press becomes the battlefield. Democratic papers publish endless columns of Union losses, casualty lists printed in black borders, photographs of shattered regiments. 4 more years of Lincoln, they sneer, and 4 more years of coffins. Republican editors fight back, warning that a peace without victory would be surrender, that disunion means death to the Republic itself. But their words strike tired ears. On the ground, the mood is darker still. Families count their sons, those buried in Virginia, those lost at sea, those maimed in Pennsylvania. Cities reel from draft riots and food shortages. The cost of war crushes farmers and merchants alike. And always, the South presses forward, its armies emboldened by steady supplies from Europe. To many voters, Lincoln's cause looks less like liberty and more like futility. When Election Day arrives, November's chill grips the land. Soldiers at the front cast their votes in mud and candlelight. Civilians shuffle to polling stations in tense silence. Ballots fall like stones into a well of history. The count is brutal. In city after city, state after state, Lincoln trails. New York goes Democratic. Illinois, Lincoln's own home, teeters and falls. Even Ohio wavers. By midnight, the map is clear. George McClellan has been elected the 17th President of the United States. For Lincoln, the defeat is personal and national. He accepts the result with weary dignity, bowing to the will of the people. But in private, he is shattered. The Union has not just lost its war, it has lost its will. Across the South, celebrations erupt. Fireworks blaze over Richmond. Church bells toll in Charleston. Newspapers declare that independence is no longer a dream, but destiny. Jefferson Davis, reading the election results, writes only 2 words in his journal: "We have won." In London and Paris, the outcome is hailed as proof that history has turned. Recognition of the Confederacy is now a formality, not a gamble. Foreign investment surges southward. War loans are extended with confidence. The Confederacy stands not as rebellion, but as a nation. For America, the cost is immeasurable. The Union flag still flies, but over half a nation, not a whole one. The dream of one republic, indivisible, has collapsed. And the man who tried to save it, Abraham Lincoln, fades into history as the president who lost the American Union. The world now faces a new reality: a North and a South, locked forever in rivalry. 2 nations born from one revolution, destined to shape and perhaps shatter the century ahead. Richmond, 1865. The war ends, not with Union triumph, but with Southern independence. Cannons thunder in celebration. Crowds surge through Capitol Square, waving bunting, singing hymns, throwing hats to the sky. Jefferson Davis appears on the balcony, hand raised, face like carved marble. Bells peal. Brass bands blare Dixie. From the rooftops, boys loose fireworks that cut white scars across the night. Then morning comes. The smoke clears. The machinery of a new nation grinds to life. Couriers race down Broad Street with copies of a treaty inked in exhaustion and bitterness. The North recognizes the Confederate States. Borders are drawn along rivers and scars. Washington, once seized in shock, has been evacuated by Confederate troops, a magnanimous gesture, Richmond newspapers boast, while the Union capital remains exiled in Philadelphia. Between the nations, a frontier hardens. Forts rise like broken teeth. Inside the Confederate capital, lawmakers move quickly, almost feverishly. They do not merely restore slavery. They braid it into the nation's spine. Statutes multiply, precise, cold, mechanical. Enslaved people are property. Permanently. Across generations. Any man who teaches an enslaved child to read faces prison. Any owner who manumits without state permission faces fines, seizure, disgrace. Patrols expand, regularized and funded. Rewards are posted. The law does not whisper. It roars. Plantations, bruised by war, come back to life with a brutal efficiency. Overseers return to the fields with new ledgers, new whips, new iron. Cotton and sugar drive the engine. Tobacco feeds its appetite. British machinery clatters in refurbished ginneries. French agents sign purchase contracts in fine ink and finer gloves. Shirts mend. Gins spin. Bales rise. Profit flows. For the enslaved, the dawn brings no light. Families sundered by wartime flight are hunted, marched in chains back to the low country, back to the Delta, back to the red soils of Georgia. Night riders patrol roads that once saw runs to Union lines. Shackles glint under lanterns. In cabins, whispers shrink to breaths, of coded hymns, of distant rivers, of maps traced in ash and hope. Resistance survives, smaller, sharper, forced into the cracks. Tools dulled with sand, cotton-seeded light, messages carried in the fold of a turban or the turn of a song. Confederate newspapers christen the moment with grand rhetoric. They call it order, stability, the natural foundation of the Southern Republic. Behind the editorials, auditors tally the cost. War debts loom like thunderheads. State governments quarrel over rail subsidies and tariffs. States' rights bites its own tail. Governors bristle when Richmond asks for taxes, troops obedience. The Confederacy has won its independence and inherited its contradictions. Hunger gnaws at the margins. Poor white farmers, promised a paradise of freedom from northern despotism, find prices high and credit tight. Speculators, satin-vested and well-connected, scoop up land at courthouse auctions. Veterans return to fields already mortgaged twice. The planter elite, fewer in number, louder in Parliament, consolidates. Talk of honor softens the sound of coins. On the militia grounds, uniforms don't match. Some soldiers wear gray frock coats. Others wear homespun patched at the knee. Rifles are better now, thanks to those discreet European cargoes. But trains are unreliable, rails twisted by wartime raids, bridges rebuilt from green timber that groans in flood. Commissaries miscount, misplace, misdirect. The old Confederate disease, shortages and squabbling masked by courage, has not been cured, only dressed. Beyond the borders, ambition prickles. Cotton kings fantasize about a Caribbean necklace. Cuba, perhaps, a coaling station in Nassau, a foothold on the Yucatan. In Texas, schemers draw arrows toward New Mexico and Sonora, speaking softly of security and markets. The language is commerce. The meaning is expansion. Slavery needs land like a furnace needs coal. It will not sit still. And yet, for all the brass bands and balcony speeches, fear lingers. A free nation to the north, angry, wounded, half its heart torn away, watches with narrowed eyes. Spies trade lists across the frontier. Veterans in blue drill on Pennsylvania fields under new commanders with new doctrines. Newspapers in Philadelphia print editorials that end with a single word: remember. Religion and ritual try to fill the gap where mercy should be. In Savannah and Natchez, Thanksgiving sermons praise Providence for settling the American contest in accordance with order. Women's societies sew flags for newly raised regiments of patrol. Children memorize catechisms that sanctify hierarchy. A whole culture is engineered to hold up a single pillar: human bondage. But pillars crack. Quietly. Slowly. From within. On a mild spring night near the Ashley River, a field hand slips a folded paper under a millstone. It's a list of names. Those sold away during the war. Those whipped last week. Those resolved to vanish after harvest. In the piney woods of East Texas, a black preacher changes a single verse of a hymn and 30 people learn a meeting place. In Richmond itself, a boy working in the Capitol stables learns to read by candlelight from a tattered pamphlet stolen off a diplomat's seat. Letters form. Words sharpen. The future, outlawed on paper, learns to breathe. The Confederacy believes it has chained time, that it has bound the century to a ledger and a lash. But history hates locks, and keys have a way of finding pockets. Tonight, the President of the Confederate States steps from the glare of celebration into the cool of strategy, his desk littered with treaties, tariffs, and telegrams from Europe. Tomorrow, he will step onto the world's stage. Richmond, spring of 1865. The war is over, and Jefferson Davis emerges not as the embattled leader of a desperate rebellion, but as the president of a new nation. His face, lined with strain, is now sculpted into marble busts, his speeches quoted in newspapers from Charleston to Paris. Where once he wrote letters by candlelight in fear of Union advance, now he pens proclamations that echo across the Atlantic. Davis styles himself not as a mere regional leader, but as the founding father of a second American republic. In the rotunda of the Confederate Capitol, portraits are unveiled, Washington for the Union, Davis for the Confederacy. Artists paint him in Roman grandeur, robes flowing, his features sharpened by destiny. Newspapers proclaim him the man who restored liberty to the South. But behind the pageantry lies calculation. Davis knows the Confederacy's survival depends on more than battlefield victories. It needs recognition, legitimacy, a place among nations. The opportunity is ripe. London, soot-stained and hungry for cotton, now sends envoys with cautious smiles. Manchester mills hum again, fueled by southern bales. In Paris, Napoleon III welcomes Confederate diplomats with velvet ceremony. His ambitions in Mexico demand a partner across the Gulf, and Davis fits the role perfectly. The treaties are discreet, but the effects are immediate. Confederate bonds sell in European markets. War loans transform into development funds. British rifles arrive not as contraband, but as commerce. French steamships ferry cotton across the Atlantic with the protection of imperial flags. For the first time, the Confederacy feels less like a rebellion and more like a nation secure. Davis seizes the moment with theatrical flair. He hosts banquets in Richmond, gilded halls echoing with toasts to Southern liberty. Foreign officers in braid and medals dine beside planter aristocrats. Ministers sign trade agreements over glasses of Bordeaux. The Confederate president raises his cup and declares, "We have secured not only independence, but respect." And yet, triumph is never without tension. Davis's cabinet fractures beneath the weight of victory. Vice President Alexander Stephens grumbles about centralization, states' rights chafing against Richmond's new authority. Governors resent taxes levied for rail repair and debt repayment. Davis, unbending, silences dissent with icy precision. This is no longer a rebellion, he tells his ministers. It is a nation, and a nation must have order. For the planter class, Davis becomes a saint. They flood him with letters of gratitude, naming sons after him, sending gifts of cotton bolts and carved silver. For poor whites, the adulation is more strained. Their sons bled for independence, but now return to find the planter elite clutching power more tightly than ever. Still, Davis maneuvers with skill, offering medals, pensions, parades to veterans, enough to keep discontent in check. The enslaved, of course, know Davis as something else entirely, the architect of their chains. His proclamations sanctify slavery as eternal, his speeches defend it as divine. On plantations from Virginia to Texas, his triumph means only despair. Yet even here, whispers circulate. Some enslaved men call him Pharaoh Davis, the tyrant who believes himself untouchable. And like pharaohs of old, the greater his monument, the greater his blind spot. In Richmond's churches, sermons thunder that Davis is chosen by God. Ministers proclaim the Confederacy's survival proof of divine blessing. The narrative hardens. Defeat was never possible, independence was destiny. For Davis, such myths are political gold. They give him a throne not just of law, but of faith. The world watches. In London, Palmerston acknowledges that the American experiment has split. In Paris, Napoleon plots deeper entanglements in Mexico under the Confederate shadow. In Berlin, Bismarck raises an eyebrow at the emergence of a new power on the Atlantic stage. Even St. Petersburg takes notice. Two Americas, not one. The balance of power shifts like tectonic plates. For Jefferson Davis, it is vindication. Years of exile in Washington politics, years of defeat and doubt, now erased. He strides through Richmond with the bearing of a Caesar who has crossed the Rubicon and found his empire waiting. Statues rise. Coins bear his profile. Children in schoolhouses recite his name alongside the Declaration of Independence. But triumph breeds overconfidence. In his triumph, Davis does not yet see the cracks, the restless poor, the hidden resistance of the enslaved, the ever-watchful Union to the north. For now, however, history crowns him. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, father of a nation built not on freedom, but on chains, stands triumphant. Yet every triumph carries within it the seed of downfall. And as Davis revels in glory, storms already gather on the horizon. Philadelphia, 1865. The war is lost. The treaty ink is dry. The Confederate States stand independent. And the United States, once the rising colossus of the Western Hemisphere, staggers into an uncertain future. The retreat is not just military. It is national. It is spiritual. The capital remains in Philadelphia, its halls hurriedly refitted to host Congress. The White House in Washington lies abandoned, windows shattered, walls scorched, a mausoleum to a dream that failed. Visitors describe it as a haunted shell, ivy crawling up its columns, wind whistling through its ruined chambers. To many Northerners, it is a wound that never heals. The Union Army, demoralized, limps home. Regiments disband in silence. Veterans, once hailed as defenders of liberty, now return to jeers and whispers. Why did you bleed? Neighbors ask. What did you gain? Fields are tilled again by men missing limbs. Cities fill with beggars in faded blue coats. The scars of war stretch from Boston to Chicago. Lincoln, defeated at the polls, fades into obscurity. George McClellan, sworn in as president, inherits a battered republic. His mandate is clear: peace with the South, reconciliation at home. But reconciliation proves fragile. Copperhead Democrats call for reconciliation with Richmond, trading recognition for stability. Radical Republicans, furious at the betrayal of emancipation, vow resistance. The party fractures, its leaders bitter and powerless. McClellan's government attempts to stabilize the nation. Tariffs are raised, debts restructured, militias reorganized. Yet the atmosphere is one of surrender. Every measure reeks of compromise, every decision overshadowed by the Confederacy's triumph. Philadelphia newspapers cautiously urge citizens to move forward, but every editorial is shadowed by defeat. In the North's great cities, unrest simmers. Laborers, squeezed by taxes and inflation, riot against draft laws that still linger in memory. Immigrant communities, once enticed by the promise of a united republic, now feel betrayed, wondering if they sacrificed blood for nothing. In New York, anti-war rallies spill into the streets. In Boston, abolitionists gather in silence, mourning not just the enslaved still bound in the South, but the very soul of the Union. Industry, however, does not die. The Northern economy, battered but resilient, claws its way back. Railroads stretch westward, factories churn, coal mines blaze with fire. But expansion feels less triumphant, more desperate. The Union's destiny, once manifest across the continent, now stalls at the Mason-Dixon line. Every mile of track laid westward carries the ghost of the question: will the South claim it too? The psychological retreat is worse. Once, Americans boasted of their republic as the shining beacon of democracy. Now the world sees two fractured nations, one industrial and bruised, the other agrarian and chained. European newspapers mock the American experiment as a failure. Monarchs smirk that liberty cannot hold a continent together. The Union, once proud, now stares at its reflection and sees only weakness. Among the people, division festers. Some cling to hatred of the South, vowing that the war will resume one day, that the Confederacy will pay in blood. Others accept division as permanent, counseling their children that the United States must now live within its limits. And still others, broken by years of loss, simply turn away, focusing on farms, businesses, survival. The Republic shrinks not just in borders, but in spirit. The enslaved who had fled north during the war now live in limbo. Thousands of black families cluster in northern cities, unwelcome yet unwilling to return. Their presence is a constant reminder of what was lost, the proclamation that never came, the freedom denied. Abolitionists fight for their rights, but the energy of the cause wanes. Without victory, without Lincoln, the great moral crusade withers. And across the border, Confederate newspapers gloat. They print editorials describing the North as a republic in decay, a rival unworthy of respect. Richmond officials quietly fund agents in northern cities, feeding unrest, stoking dissent. A fractured Union, they know, will never rise again. The retreat of the Union is not marked by armies marching home, but by silence. By empty halls in Washington. By veterans staring into fields. By a flag that now feels smaller, dimmer, less certain. The United States has not died, but it has been diminished. Its future, once bold, unbounded, inevitable, is now shrouded in doubt. And as the Northern Republic turns inward to lick its wounds, the Confederacy grows ever bolder. The word Reconstruction in our history meant rebirth. The Union triumphant, slavery destroyed, a new order painfully forged from the ashes of war. But in this alternate world, Reconstruction takes a darker meaning. It is not a project of emancipation. It is a scramble for survival. Philadelphia becomes a capital of paperwork and penance. Committees bloom like weeds. On war debts, on pensions, on rail repair, on refugees, on the status of loyalists trapped behind Confederate lines. Hearings stretch into the night. Witnesses weep. Clerks scratch ink until their fingers cramp. The government does not stride, it shuffles. McClellan's administration brands its program National Restoration. The phrase has the right shape, but inside it is hollow. There is no authority to impose terms on the South, no army to occupy, no moral thunderclap to reforge a constitution. Instead, there are memoranda and compromises. Customs regimes along the new border are negotiated with a rival flag. Post offices sort mail addressed to Richmond. Revenue men argue over tariffs as if paper can heal a sundered republic. In Congress, radical Republicans fight like cornered wolves. They push for federal guarantees for black refugees, for schools, for suffrage, for anything that might salvage the nation's soul. They lose again and again. Peace first, principles later, moderates say. Later never arrives. A narrow Refugee Relief Act passes, thin as muslin. Rations, blankets, small stipends. The North feeds bodies but starves the future. The shadow people of this Reconstruction move silently through it. Formerly enslaved families who fled during the war and now crowd northern alleys and church basements. They carry papers that confirm nothing, testimonies that convince no one. Factory foremen turn them away with a shrug. Unions mutter about cheap labor. Charities burn through donations by Christmas and close by spring. Still, the refugees endure. They form congregations in rented rooms above stables. They open night schools behind shuttered storefronts. On chalkboards salvaged from discarded crates, children trace letters like sparks. Courts turn into battlegrounds. Lawyers for Northern rail syndicates sue for access through border states now aligned with Richmond. State attorneys general invoke sovereignty like a spell. Judges issue opinions that read like surrender letters. The Constitution, built for one nation, struggles to govern half of one. Amendments are proposed that would codify the permanence of the new boundary to end agitation. None secure the votes. The parchment will not admit the wound it bears. On the frontier, Reconstruction means rifles. The Union hustles westward, hammering rails across prairie and sage to prove that it still possesses a continental future. Station towns explode into existence, depots, saloons, telegraph huts ticking like nervous hearts. But supply chains kink at the border, and southern buyers outbid northern quartermasters for mules and timber. Federal forts sprout along the Platte and the Arkansas, stockades bristling against raiders, rustlers, rumors, and the possibility of Confederate filibusters sliding in from Texas with dreams of New Mexico and beyond. Native nations read the wind with sober eyes. Treaties, once ignored by a single expanding republic, now land on tables from two. Agents in blue coats and gray vests arrive in sequence, each promising annuities, each warning of the other's duplicity. Councils stretch for days. Pipe smoke twines with suspicion. The division of the United States multiplies duplicity on ground already slick with it. At home, Reconstruction budgets bite. Taxes climb to service bonds sold during the war at dear rates. A widow in Albany pawns her wedding band to pay the levy on her shop. A machinist in Pittsburgh curses when excise men audit his lathes. For what? He asks. To pay interest on a war we lost? In taverns, talk turns seditious. Not secession. No one is foolish enough to try that again. But nullification in miniature, county boards refusing mandates they cannot afford. The republic frays at the edges while the center recites oaths. The army is rebuilt in the mold of caution. Engineers multiply. Artillerists drill until their ears ring. Commanders study European manuals and promise never again to squander lives in romantic charges. A defensive doctrine crystallizes like frost. Fortify the rivers, weld the Great Lakes into a moat, harden the rail junctions, hold the passes. The flag retreats into a shield. Northern newspapers mount a campaign of forgetting. Editorials insist on practicality. Let commerce lead and healing will follow, they write. Yet every ledger column ends in a deficit of meaning. A generation of schoolchildren grows up reciting 2 maps and 2 names for a war their parents refuse to explain. Meanwhile, the Confederacy conducts its own reconstruction with iron and scripture. Patrol statutes tighten. Fugitive clauses sharpen. Militia musters become parades of ideology. Counties erect monuments before they repair bridges. The South stitches the narrative of victory into every sermon and courthouse seal, while repairing rails with European capital and enslaved hands. The future is engineered to look like the past, only richer. And still cracks open. Smuggling blossoms along rivers like moonlight on water. Salt and sugar moving north, coal and manufactured goods sliding south. Border towns thrive on duplicity. A shopkeeper in Wheeling rings the till twice, once for the customs man and once for the truth. A riverboat captain keeps 2 ledgers in 2 different pockets and prays he never grabs the wrong one. In Philadelphia, a small committee, half senators, half merchants, meets in a narrow room that smells of ink and damp wool. They stare at charts of exports and interest rates and whisper a new phrase: external guarantees. Loans, alliances, insurance against being prey in a world of predators. The United States, once the bully of its own destiny, now seeks a patron's umbrella when the weather turns. To the north, an umbrella waits, stitched with a Union Jack. For in Ottawa and London, men study the same maps, run the same sums, and come to a different conclusion entirely. A broken America is an opportunity. For markets. For borders. For power. And somewhere on the chill water of the St. Lawrence, a squadron hoists anchor and turns west, steel hulls knifing toward the lakes, toward a frontier that thinks it is quiet. It won't be quiet for long. London, 1866. The map of North America lies stretched across a polished mahogany table in Whitehall. Pins mark Charleston, Richmond, New Orleans, and Havana. A crimson thread traces shipping lanes across the Atlantic, from Liverpool to the Caribbean, from Halifax to Charleston. Around the table, Britain's ministers lean in, the smoke of their cigars curling like the fog of empire. For Britain, the American war has yielded what decades of diplomacy could not: a fractured republic. No longer does a single United States loom over the hemisphere. Instead, there are 2 weaker rivals, distracted and suspicious of one another. To an empire that feeds on balance, this division is a gift. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston frames the question bluntly. Gentlemen, the American eagle has broken its wings. Shall we help it mend, or shall we profit while it limps? The stakes are immense. The Confederacy supplies cotton, the lifeblood of Britain's mills. The Union supplies wheat, feeding Britain's workers. Trade with both is essential, but alignment carries risk. Too much favor toward Richmond might provoke Philadelphia. Too much sympathy with Philadelphia might threaten the southern ports Britain now depends on. The Admiralty urges caution. A divided America must remain divided, one admiral warns. If ever they reconcile, they will again challenge us on the seas. But the merchants of Liverpool speak louder. To them, cotton is king and Confederate bonds, backed by British banks, must be protected at any cost. And so the gamble begins. In the Caribbean, British gunboats quietly patrol the channels, ensuring security for commerce. In truth, they shield Confederate shipping, guaranteeing that cotton flows uninterrupted to Manchester. In Canada, the garrisons swell. Fortresses along the St. Lawrence thrum with activity, scarlet uniforms drilling in the snow. The Royal Navy's ironclads anchor in Halifax, their presence a silent message. Britain is watching the American border. Meanwhile, British diplomats play a subtler game. Envoys in Richmond whisper of partnership, of preferential trade agreements, of technology exchanges. In Philadelphia, envoys preach moderation, dangling loans and investments in railroads, so long as the Union accepts the permanence of division. Britain presents itself as the arbiter, the indispensable power holding balance across the Atlantic. But gambles carry risks. The Union seethes at British interference. Newspapers bristle with anger, calling Britain the vulture at America's carcass. Veterans groups curse the Redcoats, swearing they will never forgive Britain for siding with Richmond during the war. Politicians thunder in Congress that British forts on the northern frontier are an insult to American sovereignty. Philadelphia prints more bonds, more rifles, more fortifications, pointing not just south but north. In the Confederacy, suspicion lingers too. Planters welcome British gold, but whisper fears that dependence may turn to chains. Cotton may be king, one Georgian senator mutters, but England wears the crown. Davis, proud and wary, accepts Britain's friendship but bristles at its terms. He knows the South has exchanged one yoke for another, swapping Washington's dictates for London's loans. Yet for the moment, Britain's gamble appears to pay off. Trade soars. Mills in Manchester roar back to life, spindles clattering like musket fire. British banks fatten on Confederate debt. The Royal Navy enjoys unrivaled access to Caribbean coaling stations, stretching the empire's reach. The Union, boxed in and bitter, cannot challenge Britain without risking annihilation. Still, unease creeps through the smoke-filled rooms of Whitehall. America, divided or not, remains vast, restless, unpredictable. British ministers remember the Revolution, the War of 1812, the bitterness that lingers like scar tissue. They know that resentment festers on both sides of the American divide. One day, the wounded eagle might spread its wings again. But for now, Britain smiles. Its gamble secures cotton, commerce, and influence. The Union sulks in defeat. The Confederacy struts in triumph. And the empire of Queen Victoria reaps profit from the ashes of America's Civil War. Yet even in this moment of confidence, shadows stir. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon III watches with his own ambitions. In Mexico, French troops march beneath a foreign emperor's banner, their presence daring Britain to share the stage. The British gamble has paid for now. But the game is not Britain's alone. And as empires circle the divided Americas, a new question looms. Who will claim the hemisphere itself? Mexico City, 1866. Beneath the shadow of Chapultepec Castle, French soldiers drill in perfect formation. Their bayonets gleam in the sun, their blue coats crisp despite the dust of foreign soil. Over the palace gates flies the tricolor of France, beside it the banner of a fragile empire, the crest of Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. In our history, this grand experiment faltered, crushed beneath the weight of Mexican resistance and the return of a triumphant Union. But in this alternate timeline, where the Confederacy stands and the Union is broken, the stage is transformed. France no longer fears the wrath of a reunited America. Napoleon III's gamble in Mexico is no longer folly, it is opportunity. Napoleon, restless and ambitious, imagines a Latin empire in the New World. With Confederate independence secure, he seized the chance to anchor French power across the Gulf. Cotton from Dixie, silver from Mexico, and Caribbean trade, all tied to Paris by treaty, by bayonet, and by ambition. Maximilian, young, idealistic, but naive, becomes the face of this dream. Crowned in a lavish ceremony, he promises reforms, railroads, and order. French advisors whisper in his ear, Confederate envoys shake his hand, and European investors line up with contracts. On paper, the empire looks strong. But Mexico is not paper. It is blood and mountains and rebellion. In the villages of Puebla and Oaxaca, guerrillas refuse to kneel. They strike from the hills, cutting supply lines, ambushing patrols, fading back into the wilderness. Peasant farmers curse the foreigners in their fields. Indigenous communities rally around the banner of resistance, their hatred sharpened by centuries of betrayal. The empire exists in Mexico City, in Veracruz, in the rail yards guarded by bayonets. But beyond the torchlight of French garrisons, the land belongs to insurgents. Still, France adapts. With Confederate support, supply chains strengthen. Southern cotton moves through Veracruz, funding French logistics. Confederate officers, veterans of the Civil War, arrive as observers, advising Maximilian's forces on counterinsurgency. A shadow alliance begins to form. Richmond and Mexico City bound by mutual interest, Paris smiling over both. For Napoleon III, it is a geopolitical masterpiece. He has created a southern buffer against the fractured Union, an ally against British dominance in the Caribbean, a showcase of French imperial ambition. He proclaims in Paris that the new Latin Empire will rival the Anglo-Saxon world, stretching from the Rio Grande to the Andes. But the cracks spread quickly. Maximilian's reforms, abolishing debt peonage, limiting forced labor, promising land redistribution, alienate the very conservative elites who invited him. Landowners mutter in salons, priests grumble from pulpits. Confederate diplomats, horrified by even mild reforms, pressure him to preserve hierarchy. Order before liberty, they warn. Caught between ideals and allies, Maximilian drifts into paralysis. Meanwhile, the Union watches from the north. Weaken, yes, but not blind. Philadelphia newspapers rage against foreign monarchs in the hemisphere, invoking the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine even as the Union lacks the power to enforce it. Veterans mutter in taverns that one day the Republic will march south again, that Maximilian's empire is only buying time before reckoning. And in Mexico itself, resistance refuses to die. Benito Juarez, exiled but unbroken, moves from camp to camp, his words burning hotter than bullets. This empire will fall, he tells his followers, because it does not belong to Mexico, and what is not ours will never last. His partisans carry his words into the hills, into the churches, into the hearts of farmers with machetes and muskets. By 1867, the French Empire in Mexico stands glittering but brittle. Confederate trade sustains it. French troops defend it. But every road outside the capital hums with danger. Every harvest risks rebellion. The empire is a palace built on sand, magnificent in appearance, fragile beneath the surface. Napoleon III, drunk on dreams of grandeur, does not see the storm building. He believes Confederate strength will shield his project, that European might will crush resistance. But history whispers otherwise. Empires imposed by foreigners rarely last, and Mexico is no stranger to shaking them off. For now, though, the tricolor waves. French drums roll through Mexico City. Maximilian rides in gilded carriages, his smile rehearsed, his crown polished. The Confederacy applauds, Britain watches warily, and the Union clenches its fists in silence. But in the mountains, rifles are being cleaned. In the valleys, knives are sharpened. And in the hearts of Mexico's people, patience is measured not in years, but in centuries. The empire glitters. But beneath the glitter, dynamite waits. Draw a line on a map. Start at the Atlantic. Run it up the Potomac. Bend it along the Blue Ridge. Dip to the Tennessee. Hook west to the Mississippi. Then keep going, across prairies, over high desert, through canyon and sage, until the line finally meets the Pacific wind. On one side, the United States, wounded, wary, industrial lungs heaving smoke. On the other, The Confederate States, agrarian and armored in law, its economy lashed to cotton and credit. 2 flags. 1 continent. An armistice pretending to be a future. The border is not a fence. It is a nervous system. It twitches. It sends pulses. Telegraph wires sing with accusations. Customs houses multiply like barnacles. Forts stare at forts across river bends. Between them, smuggling thrives. Night boats slide under cottonwood shadows, tarred oars muffled in rags. A barrel of salt crosses north. A crate of machine fittings slips south. The profit is quiet. The traffic is constant. Railroads become bayonets laid on the land. The Union races steel across the plains to prove momentum. Ties thud. Spikes ring. Telegraph masts tick. Chicago booms, a furnace of ambition. St. Louis, now a border city, reinvents itself as a gateway in iron and oath. In the South, new lines knit cotton counties to ports. British engineers survey with brass instruments and clipped praise. New Orleans hums like a hive. Mobile learns to speak in steam. Savannah scrapes barnacles from its memory and begins again. In the West, the vacuum yawns. Texas watches the mesas to its north and whispers of destiny. Filibuster maps sprout in back rooms, arrows sliding toward New Mexico, toward the Gadsden Stripe, toward Sonora's thirsty valleys. Confederate newspapers call it security. Planters call it soil. The Army calls it logistics. Everyone calls it inevitable, until Union cavalry out of Fort Union shows up in the red dawn and makes inevitable look expensive. Native nations see opportunity and danger in equal measure. 2 rival governments now court, threaten, bribe. Delegations ride east in pairs, one to Richmond, one to Philadelphia, carrying the same grievances to 2 different desks. Treaties pile up like dry leaves. Promises overlap and ignite. A winter annuity arrives twice in Kansas and not at all in Indian Territory. By spring, a war party rides with Springfield rifles purchased in a St. Louis alley and powder stamped in Manchester. The border turns their homelands into chessboards, their lives into bargaining chips, their resilience into the continent's last honest currency. Espionage hardens from rumor to profession. The Union Bureau of Military Information is reborn in quieter rooms, its agents moving under aliases with ledgers instead of sabers. Across the line, Confederate inspectors arrive at river towns with too many questions about tonnage and timber. Pinkerton men, once chasing train robbers, now shadow cotton factors and consuls with notebooks that fill faster than the ink can dry. One ledger left in a Cincinnati boarding house triggers a tariff crisis in Charleston. One intercepted pouch near Fredericksburg reveals a British schedule for coaling stations. Documents become bullets that never miss. Economies fork. The Union leans into iron and grain. Pittsburgh glows like a second sun. Milwaukee silos climb. New England mills pivot from cotton to wool, from southern bales to Canadian fields, from cheap labor to new machines that never sleep. The Confederacy sinks deeper roots into plantation arithmetic, but builds a modern shell around it. Gins with brass fittings, presses driven by imported engines, counting houses fluent in London's interest and Lyon's insurance. The result is schizophrenic, a medieval core wrapped in a Victorian skin. Immigration tilts. Ships reach New York with steerage stacked rail high, but the pitch of the promise has changed. Work, not glory, the pamphlets say. Germans, Irish, and Scandinavians disembark and find a republic that wants their hands but cannot promise their children a single flag. South of the line, the flow is narrower, curated. Confederate agents recruit dockyard carpenters, mechanics, gunsmiths, the skills the planter class lacks, and keep out the rest. Money has a gate. Freedom does not. On the Great Lakes, the water bristles. New ironclads patrol winter ice like wolves on a frozen river. U.S. forts at Detroit and Buffalo sprout new batteries. Across in Canada, British garrisons drill under flags that snap like whips in the wind. Rumors churn. Alaska will be sold, not to a diminished Union, but to Britain, a cold keystone locking the North Pacific under a single crown. Newspapers in Philadelphia call it theft. papers in Richmond call it none of their concern. In Sitka, Russian clerks count coins in stunned silence and wonder which anthem to practice. California, distant and decisive, becomes a fulcrum. San Francisco swallows ships whole and spits out capital. The Union anchors its Pacific ambition there, throwing dry docks at the ocean and treaties at Asia. Confederate merchants try to break in through Baja and Guaymas, offering silver and sugar, but Pacific trade speaks a brisk, northern dialect now. The Sierra Nevada stands like a firewall. Culture splits with the rails. Northern schools teach a republic wounded but righteous, determined to outbuild fate. Southern schools teach a nation ordained, its hierarchy sanctified by scripture and victory. Two histories grow from the same root and twist in opposite directions. The printing press becomes an army. The pulpit becomes a drill field. The past, edited, minted, sung, marches forward to colonize the future. By 1867, the French Empire in Mexico stands glittering but brittle. Confederate trade sustains it. French troops defend it. But every road outside the capital hums with danger. Every harvest risks rebellion. The empire is a palace built on sand, magnificent in appearance, fragile beneath the surface. Napoleon III, drunk on dreams of grandeur, does not see the storm building. He believes Confederate strength will shield his project, that European might will crush resistance. But history whispers otherwise. Empires imposed by foreigners rarely last, and Mexico is no stranger to shaking them off. For now, though, the tricolor waves. French drums roll through Mexico City. Maximilian rides in gilded carriages, his smile rehearsed, his crown polished. The Confederacy applauds, Britain watches warily, and the Union clenches its fists in silence. But in the mountains, rifles are being cleaned. In the valleys, knives are sharpened. And in the hearts of Mexico's people, patience is measured not in years, but in centuries. The empire glitters. But beneath the glitter, dynamite waits. Draw a line on a map. Start at the Atlantic. Run it up the Potomac. Bend it along the Blue Ridge. Dip to the Tennessee. Hook west to the Mississippi. Then keep going, across prairies, over high desert, through canyon and sage, until the line finally meets the Pacific wind. On one side, the United States, wounded, wary, industrial lungs heaving smoke. On the other, the Confederate States, agrarian and armored in law, its economy lashed to cotton and credit. Two flags. One continent. An armistice pretending to be a future. The border is not a fence. It is a nervous system. It twitches. It sends pulses. Telegraph wires sing with accusations. Customs houses multiply like barnacles. Forts stare at forts across river bends. Between them, smuggling thrives. Night boats slide under cottonwood shadows, tarred oars muffled in rags. A barrel of salt crosses north. A crate of machine fittings slips south. The profit is quiet. The traffic is constant. Railroads become bayonets laid on the land. The Union races steel across the plains to prove momentum. Ties thud. Spikes ring. Telegraph masts tick. Chicago booms, a furnace of ambition. St. Louis, now a border city, reinvents itself as a gateway in iron and oath. In the South, new lines knit cotton counties to ports. British engineers survey with brass instruments and clipped praise. New Orleans hums like a hive. Mobile learns to speak in steam. Savannah scrapes barnacles from its memory and begins again. In the West, the vacuum yawns. Texas watches the mesas to its north and whispers of destiny. Filibuster maps sprout in back rooms, arrows sliding toward New Mexico, toward the Gadsden Stripe, toward Sonora's thirsty valleys. Confederate newspapers call it security. Planters call it soil. The Army calls it logistics. Everyone calls it inevitable, until Union cavalry out of Fort Union shows up in the red dawn and makes inevitable look expensive. Native nations see opportunity and danger in equal measure. Two rival governments now court, threaten, bribe. Delegations ride east in pairs. One to Richmond, one to Philadelphia, carrying the same grievances to two different desks. Treaties pile up like dry leaves. Promises overlap and ignite. A winter annuity arrives twice in Kansas, and not at all in Indian Territory. By spring, a war party rides with Springfield rifles purchased in a St. Louis alley and powder stamped in Manchester. The border turns their homelands into chessboards, their lives into bargaining chips, their resilience into the continent's last honest currency. Espionage hardens from rumor to profession. The Union Bureau of Military Information is reborn in quieter rooms, its agents moving under aliases with ledgers instead of sabers. Across the line, Confederate inspectors arrive at river towns with too many questions about tonnage and timber. Pinkerton men, once chasing train robbers, now shadow cotton factors and consuls with notebooks that fill faster than the ink can dry. One ledger left in a Cincinnati boarding house triggers a tariff crisis in Charleston. One intercepted pouch near Fredericksburg reveals a British schedule for coaling stations. Documents become bullets that never miss. Economies fork. The Union leans into iron and grain. Pittsburgh glows like a second sun. Milwaukee silos climb. New England mills pivot from cotton to wool, from southern bales to Canadian fields, from cheap labor to new machines that never sleep. The Confederacy sinks deeper roots into plantation arithmetic, but builds a modern shell around it. Gins with brass fittings, presses driven by imported engines, counting houses fluent in London's interest and Lyon's insurance. The result is schizophrenic, a medieval core wrapped in a Victorian skin. Immigration tilts. Ships reach New York with steerage stacked rail high, but the pitch of the promise has changed. Work, not glory, the pamphlets say. Germans, Irish, and Scandinavians disembark and find a republic that wants their hands, but cannot promise their children a single flag. South of the line, the flow is narrower, curated. Confederate agents recruit dockyard carpenters, mechanics, gunsmiths, the skills the planter class lacks, and keep out the rest. Money has a gate. Freedom does not. On the Great Lakes, the water bristles. New ironclads patrol winter ice like wolves on a frozen river. U.S. forts at Detroit and Buffalo sprout new batteries. Across in Canada, British garrisons drill under flags that snap like whips in the wind. Rumors churn. Alaska will be sold, not to a diminished Union, but to Britain, a cold keystone locking the North Pacific under a single crown. Newspapers in Philadelphia call it theft. Papers in Richmond call it none of their concern. In Sitka, Russian clerks count coins in stunned silence and wonder which anthem to practice. California, distant and decisive, becomes a fulcrum. San Francisco swallows ships whole and spits out capital. The Union anchors its Pacific ambition there, throwing dry docks at the ocean and treaties at Asia. Confederate merchants try to break in through Baja and Guaymas, offering silver and sugar, but Pacific trade speaks a brisk, northern dialect now. The Sierra Nevada stands like a firewall. Culture splits with the rails. Northern schools teach a republic wounded but righteous, determined to outbuild fate. Southern schools teach a nation ordained, its hierarchy sanctified by scripture and victory. Two histories grow from the same root and twist in opposite directions. The printing press becomes an army. The pulpit becomes a drill field. The past, edited, minted, sung, marches forward to colonize the future. And still, despite soldiers and sermons, the border leaks. Love letters cross it. So do cousins. So do songs. A Union hymn about endurance becomes a plantation lullaby with the nouns rearranged. A Confederate reel sneaks into a Boston parlor, and no one notices until the third measure. The continent refuses to pick a single rhythm. Then an incident. A customs inspector at Cairo, Illinois, fires on a steamboat that refuses inspection. 2 shots. 1 dead pilot. The boat burns at the dock, a floating torch in the brown river. Across in Kentucky, a Confederate patrol forms line and cocks hammers. Telegraph keys chatter like teeth in a fever. Newspapers set type as fast as they can curse. 2 Americas face each other through smoke, again. Who blinks first? Europe had always watched America with a mixture of fascination and dread. One republic, stretching from ocean to ocean, was a problem for kings. A free people rising to wealth and power threaten the logic of monarchy itself. But now, in this alternate world, the Republic is broken. The Union lies humbled, the Confederacy ascendant, and the Old World smiles. The balance of power begins to shift, not gradually, but with tremors that shake continents. In London, Parliament debates not if, but how to invest deeper in the South. Manchester's mills hum again, stuffed with cotton hauled through Charleston and New Orleans under British naval protection. Bankers in the city float new Confederate loans, their ledgers fat with profit. The Confederacy, once a desperate supplicant, now walks the halls of Whitehall as a recognized partner. Britain, master of global commerce, sees in the South a bulwark against northern tariffs and a loyal supplier of raw goods. In Paris, Napoleon III doubles down on his Mexican experiment. Confederate recognition has strengthened his hand, and Maximilian's empire feels less like a quixotic dream and more like a continental axis. Paris, Richmond, Mexico City. The French emperor speaks openly of a Latin alliance in the New World, a counterweight to both British power and Yankee ambition. French officers drill Mexican recruits with new confidence, while Confederate diplomats dine in gilded salons as honored guests. Berlin watches with curiosity. Bismarck, architect of Prussia's rising power, calculates carefully. A divided America is no rival. A Confederate cotton flow weakens British leverage, and the collapse of the Union proves a lesson. Republics are fragile, monarchies endure. German newspapers cheer Confederate victories as proof of the old order's resilience. The American dream has shattered, one Berlin paper declares. The world belongs to nations, not mobs. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander II frowns. Russia, allied to the Union during the war, now stands isolated. Russian warships once anchored in New York Harbor as a silent warning to Britain and France. Now they look like relics of a lost cause. The Tsar considers new moves in Alaska, in Asia, even in the Balkans, anywhere to offset the humiliation of backing the losing side. The Ottoman Empire, fragile and declining, reads the same lesson as Prussia. Democracy falters, hierarchy survives. Envoys from Richmond arrive in Constantinople, trading cotton for access, flattery for influence. Confederate diplomats speak of shared values, order, tradition, the defense of hierarchy. The sultans, weary of European disdain, listen. But nowhere does the shift sting more than in Philadelphia. The Union, once courted as a rising giant, now finds itself isolated. Its diplomats enter salons to cold smiles and polite pity. Britain courts the South. France crowns Mexico. Germany looks inward. Russia looks east. America north of the line is left to lick its wounds, its words of liberty drowned by the roar of Confederate cannons and European applause. And yet, the Union does not vanish. Its industries still climb, its people still innovate, its railroads still thunder west. But without continental unity, its power feels brittle, its voice hoarse. It is a nation present at the table, but seated in the corner. For the enslaved millions of the South, the shift is catastrophic. No foreign abolitionist pressure restrains Richmond. No Union proclamation offers hope. Instead, European capitals, those that once celebrated liberty, now toast a republic built on bondage. Chains clink under chandeliers. Human lives are balanced against cotton bales and stock prices. The balance of power has shifted, yes. But it has shifted toward cynicism, toward empire, toward a world where liberty is not destiny but anomaly. And across the oceans, whispers grow. If America, the great experiment, has fractured, perhaps democracy itself is doomed. The world tilts. The scales lean toward monarchy, aristocracy, hierarchy. And the Confederacy, once a rebel fledgling, perches suddenly among the great powers, its banner unfurled not just over Richmond, but across the globe. But power is never still. Alliances rot. Ambitions collide. And as Britain and France feast on America's carcass, one question festers beneath the surface. Can the Union stomach defeat forever? Or will the eagle spread its broken wings once more, no matter the cost? The war is over. The Confederacy has survived. And for millions of enslaved men, women, and children, hope dies quietly in the fields. In our history, the guns of Antietam gave Lincoln the chance to proclaim emancipation. Freedom became a weapon of war. By 1865, slavery lay in ruins. But in this world, where Washington fell, where Lincoln lost, where Richmond triumphed, the shackles remain. The plantation South breathes again, rebuilt with blood. Overseers return with ledgers and whips, barking orders over rows of bent backs. Cotton sprouts where graves had barely settled. Rice fields fill with water and with silence. Sugar plantations in Louisiana buzz with French machinery, their gears greased by sweat and sorrow. Slavery is not weakened by the war. It is reborn stronger, defended not only by Southern law, but by foreign treaties and European markets. Confederate legislatures move quickly to cement the system. The slave codes are rewritten with iron precision. Teaching a slave to read? 10 years imprisonment. Harboring a runaway? Death by hanging. Emancipation by owner? Forbidden without state approval. Slavery is no longer merely tolerated. It is sanctified, codified, celebrated as the cornerstone of the nation. In Richmond's churches, ministers thunder that bondage is ordained by God. The South has proven its righteousness on the battlefield, they proclaim. And Providence has blessed the natural order. School children memorize catechisms teaching that freedom belongs to some, chains to others. A generation is raised on victory and hierarchy. For the enslaved, the future narrows. Families torn apart during the war are not reunited, they are sold again. Slave auctions swell with new captives. Men and women marched from border states into the deep South. Traders boast of fresh stock, filling ledgers with names stripped of meaning. Children are priced by weight. Mothers weep into burlap sacks as the gavel falls. Yet chains cannot smother the human spirit entirely. Whispers move through the quarters at night. Songs carry secret meanings, hymns hiding maps, work chants disguising plans. A broken hoe left in a field signals sabotage. A burned barn whispers resistance. Some run still, darting into swamps, mountains, across the border into the fractured north. But the Union, beaten and weary, no longer welcomes them as heroes, only as burdens. Refugee camps sprout on the edges of northern cities, overcrowded, hungry, forgotten. Others resist quietly. A pot of stew missing meat, a bale of cotton packed too loose, a tool dulled beyond use. Each act small, each act dangerous, each act a spark in the darkness. But sparks alone cannot shatter chains. Not when the Confederacy is triumphant, not when Britain and France pour gold into Richmond's coffers, not when the law itself is written in blood and iron. And yet the human cost goes deeper still. Slavery does not merely bind the enslaved, it corrupts the enslaver. Planters, bloated with profit and pride, preach about honor while their estates reek of cruelty. Young men raised on victory grow arrogant, entitled, convinced that war and bondage are eternal companions. The Confederacy celebrates itself as modern, industrial, civilized. But its heart beats in chains. The world watches. In London, Manchester merchants sip tea brewed with Southern sugar, their ledgers fat with Confederate cotton. In Paris, salons toast to Maximilian's empire, supplied by Dixie's plantations. Across Europe, the cries of the enslaved are muffled by profit and politics. Slavery, once condemned as a dying relic, becomes again an accepted reality. But not everywhere. In northern cities, abolitionists refuse to go silent. They print pamphlets by candlelight, smuggle them across the border, speak from pulpits even as mobs threaten them. In secret meetings, they vow that the fight is not over. Freedom may be defeated, they whisper, but it is not dead. Still, in 1866, the picture is bleak. The Confederacy has survived and slavery with it. Chains rattle louder than ever. Families remain broken. Lives remain stolen. Hope flickers, but it does not blaze. The South calls this stability. The North calls it tragedy. But history will remember it for what it is. A crime written into the very bones of a nation. And in the darkness of the quarters, under a sky littered with stars, a voice rises in song, low, trembling, defiant. It is not freedom, but it is not silence either. For even in victory, the Confederacy cannot kill the dream that one day the chains will break. Night settles over the South. Crickets sing. Lanterns gutter in big houses. But in the quarters, in the swamps, in pine thickets where the dogs refuse to nose, something moves that law cannot cage. Resistance breathes. It starts small. A whispered name passed hand to hand. A meeting place changed at the last minute. A tin cup tapped 3 times under the table. The tiniest habits become armor. The Sabbath becomes a counsel. A hymn becomes a map. Steal away means tonight. Jordan means the river that marks the line. Across the border, the old Underground Railroad wakes like an old lion and learns new tricks. Stations move off main roads into sawmills, brickyards, canal barges. A Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania keeps one ledger for worship and another, in cipher, for fugitives. A black church in Cincinnati stores shoes in flour barrels and routes families onto flatboats at moonrise. Telegraph keys, once the Union's nervous system, now tick messages that sound like grain prices but carry times, names, distances. In the Confederacy, maroon camps sprout where swamp meets cypress and the law's courage thins. Men and women vanish between sugar rows and reappear days later with salt, knives, cartridges scavenged from river landings. They build smoke pits that hide the fire. They train lookouts who can tell the difference between a possum's rustle and a deputy's impatience. They live on fish, faith, and the knowledge that every sunrise they are still free is a bullet the Confederacy can't count. Some resistance wears uniforms. Not Union blue. Those coats are rare now, but patched gray stolen from depots and dyed with bark. Runaways join bands of timber riders, slipping through pine barrens to cut telegraph wires, burn culverts, loosen bolts on trestles that carry cotton to port. A torch placed just so. A saboteur gone before the first crack of splitting timber. Others fight with paper and ink. Literate domestic workers copy manifests, shipping lists, planter correspondence. A laundress in Savannah memorizes the dates of a patrol rotation while shaking ash from shirts. A stable boy in Richmond counts crates marked for Veracruz and whispers the numbers to a preacher who knows which riverboat captain sells information for cash and silence. Documents travel in false bottoms and biscuit tins. A single list of names, relayed across 3 states, saves 20 people from being sold to the cane. Preachers carry more than scripture. Sermons bend like bows. Moses may be a man in the second pew. Babylon may sit on the Capitol Hill. When the choir swells, a listener in the doorway hears only harmony. Those inside hear itinerary. Dates, crossings, passwords braided into call and response until the message is memorized by the body. If a patrol bursts in, the meaning drops into the floorboards and stares back as song. Women shape the war no newspaper prints. Midwives ferry messages with swaddled infants, needing rest in a cooler room. Cooks undersalt the overseer's stew and oversalt the smokehouse hams bound for market. Quilts hang on fences with patterns no guest remarks on. Flying geese, crossroads, drunkard's path. To the uninitiated, they are pretty. To the initiated, they are arrows. Even in northern cities, where welcome is thin, the resistance hardens its spine. Mutual aid societies pool coins for lawyers and coffins. Night schools teach letters in rooms that stink of coal and cabbage. A printer in Boston sets pamphlets nobody wants to read in daylight. He locks his door, ink up to his wrists, and prints anyway. Another 1,000 copies. Another 1,000 chances to remind a country what its throat once promised. The Confederacy responds with teeth. Patrols triple. Informants multiply. Rewards grow. The law tightens until it squeals. A single book discovered in a cabin earns lashes and sale. A match found near a bridge means the noose. Dogs run. Boots march. The night explodes with shouts and lanterns. Sometimes they catch a boy with an empty pocket and call it victory. Sometimes they catch nothing and call it order. The shadow keeps moving. Britain and France pretend not to notice. Cotton moves. Ports gleam. Accounts swell. Domestic disturbances, say the consuls, and sign another bill of lading. But captains hear gunshots drifting from riverbanks blacker than the sky. A Royal Navy officer, drunk and honest, admits at table that the South is quiet the way a powder magazine is quiet. The Union hears more than it says. Philadelphia wires hum with reports from the border. A busted ring here, a rescued family there, a Confederate deputy whose badge washed up a mile downstream. Officially, the government condemns lawless crossings. Unofficially, doors open. Guards look away. A colonel at a lakeside fort uses army wagons to haul excess lumber that happens to be hiding people. He files a receipt under repairs. Then fire in broad daylight. In a coastal parish, a cane field rises screaming. Overseers run. The big house shutters slam. A patrol gallops from the county seat, rifles up, boots flashing, only to find the road dug and spiked. Shots crack from the treeline. A wagon tips and burns. The patrol breaks. Word outruns the smoke. An open revolt, not a rumor, not a whisper. A parish becomes a fuse. Richmond jerks awake. Trains load with militia. Telegraphs rattle. Newspapers shriek for blood. In maroon camps, knives are sharpened to prayer. In northern boarding houses, maps unroll, and fingers trace the parish roads like veins. In Mexico City, a French colonel circles a dispatch and wonders if the wildfire will jump the border of history itself. The Confederacy has built a fortress of law and fear. The resistance has found the cracks. The first flames lick the mortar. One spark can die in rain. Or it can find the powder. Which will it be? The calendar turns. The guns of the Civil War are silent. The Confederacy endures. The United States survives in pieces, its spirit diminished. Decades pass, but the fracture never heals. And when the world plunges into the cauldron of the 20th century, the cost of that fracture is revealed. In our history, when the First World War erupted in 1914, the United States was an industrial giant, a single nation poised to tip the balance. But here, in this alternate world, there are two Americas. Two rival governments, two armies, two flags, two visions. Neither strong enough to dominate. Neither willing to unite. The Union, battered but determined, industrializes with ferocity. Pittsburgh's furnaces roar, Chicago's stockyards feed millions, Detroit assembles machines. But its power is inward, defensive, its gaze fixed warily on the Confederate border. Its navy patrols the Atlantic, not as a global fleet, but as a guard dog chained to its yard. The Confederacy, meanwhile, thrives on cotton diplomacy. Britain and France remain its patrons, their factories humming with southern exports. Richmond grows into a capital draped in marble, proud and loud. But beneath the veneer lies dependence. European banks own its debt, European merchants control its shipping, European powers quietly dictate its reach. Independence, yes, but at a cost. When the guns of August fire in Europe, both Americas watch from afar. In our reality, Woodrow Wilson pledged neutrality, then later marched the nation into war as the arsenal of democracy. In this timeline, neutrality means something darker. Philadelphia declares it will not bleed for monarchs. Richmond insists Europe's war is Europe's problem. Across the Atlantic, leaders in London and Paris exchange worried glances. Without a unified America, there is no tide of men, no flood of weapons, no industrial giant waiting to be unleashed. And when the trenches bog down in mud and blood, when Verdun screams and the Somme devours, the absence of the United States is a void that cannot be filled. Britain staggers. France bleeds. Germany pushes harder, confident that no vast republic across the sea will intervene. The Confederacy plays its own game. Southern diplomats, trained in subtlety, whisper in Berlin, in Vienna, in Constantinople. Why should we fight you? They ask. Why not trade? Confederate cotton slips into German mills through neutral ports. Confederate tobacco finds markets in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Richmond remains officially neutral, but its neutrality is profitable. The Union, meanwhile, seethes. Philadelphia fears encirclement. Britain leans on it for grain, for steel, for munitions. But the Union's arsenal is smaller, slower, hemmed in by the Confederacy's watchful eyes and Britain's cautious demands. Isolationists shout down interventionists. Veterans of the Civil War's humiliation swear no son should die on foreign soil. The arsenal of democracy is reduced to a locked cabinet, its key thrown into the Schuylkill. By 1917, Europe burns. The United States, divided, cannot tip the scales. The war ends differently. Germany does not collapse. Britain sues for peace sooner. France, battered and exhausted, concedes ground. The map of Europe is redrawn not at Versailles, but in Berlin's favor. And the echo is global. Without an American giant to restrain, old empires stagger forward. Britain clings tighter to India. France claws at Africa. Germany extends its reach east. The Confederacy, emboldened, struts onto the world stage claiming it kept its sons from the slaughter, while quietly selling the war's victors its cotton and crops. But beneath the triumphal rhetoric, both Americas know the truth. They are smaller, weaker, peripheral. The great experiment of democracy that once promised to shape the world has fractured. When history called, the United States answered not with thunder, but with silence. The world moves on. The age of empires stretches. And the arsenal of democracy, the phrase itself, is never spoken. Because in this world, the arsenal never existed. The 1930s. A world trembling on the edge of catastrophe. In our history, the Great Depression scarred nations. Fascism rose in Italy and Germany, militarism surged in Japan, and the world spiraled toward another global war. But in this alternate timeline, the fractured Americas magnify the danger. For without a united United States, the balance of the 20th century tilts toward tyranny. Marble boulevards host parades beneath banners of gray and crimson. Its leaders boast of heritage and order. Behind the pomp lies an economy still dependent on cotton, tobacco, and European markets. But its society, hardened by chains, admires strength, hierarchy, obedience. When newsreels flicker of Mussolini's black shirts or Hitler's rallies, Confederate elites nod with recognition. Order, they say, has many flags but one spirit. The Union, north of the line, endures its own struggle. It is industrial, inventive, democratic in name, but scarred by humiliation. Its politics fracture between isolationists who swear never again to bleed in foreign wars and hawks who whisper that reconciliation with the South is the only path to strength. Its factories build cars, radios, and machines, but not an army capable of projecting power overseas. Then comes 1939. Hitler invades Poland. Europe burns again. Britain and France scramble for allies. In our world, they turn to the United States, whose factories and manpower would become the arsenal of freedom. But here they find hesitation, division, weakness. Philadelphia pledges material aid, but only in trickles, steel here, grain there. Richmond declares neutrality, its ports quietly feeding German industry through third parties. Europe stares westward for salvation, but finds a continent split by its own unfinished war. By 1940, France falls. Britain stands alone. And across the globe, Japan, watching with hungry eyes, sees opportunity. The Pacific, once checked by a unified American Navy, is now a chessboard without a queen. The Union clings to California and the Pacific Northwest, but its fleet is smaller, its bases fewer. The Confederacy, tied to European trade, has no interest in defending the Pacific at all. Pearl Harbor still smolders in this timeline, but its effect is muted. The Union reels, but without southern ports, without southern manpower, without unity, it cannot wage global war. Mobilization sputters. Isolationists thunder in Congress. The Confederacy, smug in neutrality, blames Northern provocation and continues trading through neutral flags. The result is chilling. Without a united America, World War II drags longer. Britain survives the Blitz but bleeds alone. Germany tightens its grip on Europe. The Soviet Union bears the brunt of the fight against Hitler with no D-Day to relieve pressure. Japan storms across Asia unchecked, carving an empire from China to Indonesia. By 1945, the world looks unrecognizable. Hitler is not destroyed by American armies storming Normandy, but by exhaustion and Soviet steel grinding from the east. Europe lies shattered, but in a different pattern. Berlin dominates Central Europe longer. Moscow claims more of the continent. Britain shrinks further. The Pacific is not liberated by island-hopping Marines, but left smoldering under the rising sun's shadow. The absence of the United States changes everything. The American century never dawns. Instead, the 20th century belongs to tyrannies. The Soviet Union expands farther west. Japan's empire lasts longer. Fascism, even in defeat, leaves deeper scars. And the Confederacy? It sits smugly on the sidelines, calling itself the neutral republic, profiting from trade while slavery, modified into new forms of segregation and servitude, lingers deep into the modern age. Richmond's leaders claim vindication. We kept our sons from foreign graves. But the truth is simpler. They kept their nation chained to its past, even as the world marched into a darker future. The Union, for its part, survives, but not as savior, not as liberator, not as superpower. It becomes a regional power, inward-looking, haunted by what might have been. The axis rose higher in this timeline because the eagle of America was broken. And when the storm of the 20th century raged, no united wings spread to shield the world. The result was a century of shadows. The year is 1965. A century has passed since the South won its independence, and still the continent bears the scars. Two flags ripple in the American wind. One, stars and stripes, thinner now, humbled, remembered more for what it lost than what it won. The other, stars and bars, older than its years, heavy with the weight of its triumph, and stained with what it refuses to abandon. The Union survives, yes. Its factories thunder, its cities climb, its science leaps forward. But it is a smaller republic, inward-looking, cautious, wary of foreign entanglements. Its people speak of liberty, but always with a shadow in their voice, a reminder that liberty was not enough to save the nation whole. Its leaders walk the tightrope of democracy without the net of unity. Its future is still tied to its past defeat. The Confederacy too survives, but it is a nation unfinished, its foundations cracked even as it builds monuments to itself. Slavery lingers into the new century, twisting into sharecropping, segregation, and caste. Planter aristocrats cling to power, dressing their rule in the language of heritage. Cities like Atlanta and New Orleans modernize, but the fields behind them remain medieval. The chains may shift in form, but they never truly break. The border between North and South is no longer only a frontier of forts and customs houses. It is a psychological wall, a wound carved into the heart of the continent. Every map shows it. Every generation grows up with it. Schoolchildren recite two different pledges, sing two different anthems, remember two different wars. Two Americas, one soil, never reconciled. Beyond, the world changes faster than either nation can follow. Europe collapses into and out of war. Asia rises. Empires crumble. New powers emerge. And yet, North America, the giant that might have dominated it all, remains divided, hesitant, paralyzed by its own fracture. The American century never arrives. And so the world that could have been is unfinished. Democracy never ascends as the universal beacon. Tyranny lasts longer, stronger. Wars drag bloodier, heavier. Without the weight of a united republic, the scales of history tip differently, toward darkness more often than light. But even here, unfinished, the human spirit does not die. Across the South, voices rise. Some in pulpits, some in streets, some in jail cells. Songs of freedom echo against courthouse walls. The Confederacy can delay liberty, but it cannot erase it. Even in this alternate world, the dream of equality persists, clawing upward like a vine through cracks in stone. For nations may divide. Empires may rise and fall. Chains may be forged and reforged. But ideas live. And the idea of one people, free and indivisible, continues to haunt the divided continent like a ghost that will not rest. Marble boulevards host parades beneath banners of gray and crimson. Its leaders boast of heritage and order. Behind the pomp lies an economy still dependent on cotton, tobacco, and European markets. But its society, hardened by chains, admires strength, hierarchy, obedience. When newsreels flicker of Mussolini's black shirts or Hitler's rallies, Confederate elites nod with recognition. Order, they say, has many flags but one spirit. The Union, north of the line, endures its own struggle. It is industrial, inventive, democratic in name, but scarred by humiliation. Its politics fracture between isolationists who swear never again to bleed in foreign wars and hawks who whisper that reconciliation with the South is the only path to strength. Its factories build cars, radios, and machines, but not an army capable of projecting power overseas. Then comes 1939. Hitler invades Poland. Europe burns again. Britain and France scramble for allies. In our world, they turn to the United States, whose factories and manpower would become the arsenal of freedom. But here they find hesitation, division, weakness. Philadelphia pledges material aid, but only in trickles, steel here, grain there. Richmond declares neutrality, its ports quietly feeding German industry through third parties. Europe stares westward for salvation, but finds a continent split by its own unfinished war. By 1940, France falls. Britain stands alone. And across the globe, Japan, watching with hungry eyes, sees opportunity. The Pacific, once checked by a unified American Navy, is now a chessboard without a queen. The Union clings to California and the Pacific Northwest, but its fleet is smaller, its bases fewer. The Confederacy, tied to European trade, has no interest in defending the Pacific at all. Pearl Harbor still smolders in this timeline, but its effect is muted. The Union reels, but without southern ports, without southern manpower, without unity, it cannot wage global war. Mobilization sputters. Isolationists thunder in Congress. The Confederacy, smug in neutrality, blames Northern provocation and continues trading through neutral flags. The result is chilling. Without a united America, World War II drags longer. Britain survives the Blitz but bleeds alone. Germany tightens its grip on Europe. The Soviet Union bears the brunt of the fight against Hitler with no D-Day to relieve pressure. Japan storms across Asia unchecked, carving an empire from China to Indonesia. By 1945, the world looks unrecognizable. Hitler is not destroyed by American armies storming Normandy, but by exhaustion and Soviet steel grinding from the east. Europe lies shattered, but in a different pattern. Berlin dominates Central Europe longer. Moscow claims more of the continent. Britain shrinks further. The Pacific is not liberated by island-hopping Marines, but left smoldering under the rising sun's shadow. The absence of the United States changes everything. The American century never dawns. Instead, the 20th century belongs to tyrannies. The Soviet Union expands farther west. Japan's empire lasts longer. Fascism, even in defeat, leaves deeper scars. And the Confederacy? It sits smugly on the sidelines, calling itself the neutral republic, profiting from trade while slavery, modified into new forms of segregation and servitude, lingers deep into the modern age. Richmond's leaders claim vindication. We kept our sons from foreign graves. But the truth is simpler. They kept their nation chained to its past, even as the world marched into a darker future. The Union, for its part, survives, but not as savior, not as liberator, not as superpower. It becomes a regional power, inward-looking, haunted by what might have been. The axis rose higher in this timeline because the eagle of America was broken. And when the storm of the 20th century raged, no united wings spread to shield the world. The result was a century of shadows. The year is 1965. A century has passed since the South won its independence, and still the continent bears the scars. Two flags ripple in the American wind. One, stars and stripes, thinner now, humbled, remembered more for what it lost than what it won. The other, stars and bars, older than its years, heavy with the weight of its triumph, and stained with what it refuses to abandon. The Union survives, yes. Its factories thunder, its cities climb, its science leaps forward. But it is a smaller republic, inward-looking, cautious, wary of foreign entanglements. Its people speak of liberty, but always with a shadow in their voice, a reminder that liberty was not enough to save the nation whole. Its leaders walk the tightrope of democracy without the net of unity. Its future is still tied to its past defeat. The Confederacy too survives, but it is a nation unfinished, its foundations cracked even as it builds monuments to itself. Slavery lingers into the new century, twisting into sharecropping, segregation, and caste. Planter aristocrats cling to power, dressing their rule in the language of heritage. Cities like Atlanta and New Orleans modernize, but the fields behind them remain medieval. The chains may shift in form, but they never truly break. The border between North and South is no longer only a frontier of forts and customs houses. It is a psychological wall, a wound carved into the heart of the continent. Every map shows it. Every generation grows up with it. Schoolchildren recite 2 different pledges, sing 2 different anthems, remember 2 different wars. 2 Americas, 1 soil, never reconciled. Beyond, the world changes faster than either nation can follow. Europe collapses into and out of war. Asia rises. Empires crumble. New powers emerge. And yet, North America, the giant that might have dominated it all, remains divided, hesitant, paralyzed by its own fracture. The American century never arrives. And so the world that could have been is unfinished. Democracy never ascends as the universal beacon. Tyranny lasts longer, stronger. Wars drag bloodier, heavier. Without the weight of a united republic, the scales of history tip differently, toward darkness more often than light. But even here, unfinished, the human spirit does not die. Across the South, voices rise. Some in pulpits, some in streets, some in jail cells. Songs of freedom echo against courthouse walls. The Confederacy can delay liberty, but it cannot erase it. Even in this alternate world, the dream of equality persists, clawing upward like a vine through cracks in stone. For nations may divide. Empires may rise and fall. Chains may be forged and reforged. But ideas live. And the idea of one people, free and indivisible, continues to haunt the divided continent like a ghost that will not rest. The Confederacy won its war. But it did not finish the story. Because history is never finished. And in the silence of an unfinished nation, the question still lingers. What might have been, had the eagle never been broken? Night falls on the continent. 100 years after the guns of the Civil War, the echoes still rumble. 2 nations stand where one should have. The Union, industrial, cautious, scarred. The Confederacy, proud, brittle, shackled to its past. Both look in the mirror and see not triumph, but ghosts. For the Union, the ghost is failure. A republic that once promised liberty for all but surrendered half its soul at the point of a bayonet. Its people inherit democracy, but always with a question mark. Could freedom truly endure, if it could not endure its first great test? For the Confederacy, the ghost is chains. Victory bought survival, but it froze the South in amber. The world moved forward, machines, science, nations rising and falling. Yet the Confederacy clung to bondage and hierarchy. Its triumph was its prison. Across the Atlantic, empires fattened on the fracture. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, all carved a century from America's weakness. Wars dragged longer. Tyrannies lasted stronger. The 20th century became an age of shadows because the American experiment never rose to its full height. But perhaps the greatest shadow is not on maps or battlefields. It lies in the silence of millions whose freedom never came. The enslaved and their children, the refugees pushed north only to find poverty instead of promise, the voices smothered in courts, in cabins, in chains. History in this world is written by victors who declared bondage eternal. But the truth lives in whispers, in songs, in defiance that no victory parade can silence. And so the shadow stretches, not just over America, but over the idea of liberty itself. A world where the Confederacy won is a world where freedom flickers, where tyranny struts longer, where democracy is not destiny but anomaly. This is the shadow over freedom, and it reminds us why the real history mattered. Why every sacrifice, every grave at Gettysburg, every whisper in the Underground Railroad, Every line of the Emancipation Proclamation mattered. Because if the coin of history had fallen the other way, the world we know, the freedoms we take for granted, might never have existed at all. The Confederacy's victory would have reshaped the earth. But its survival would have been a monument to chains, not to liberty. This is the world that could have been, and the shadow it casts still chills the imagination.